The woman with the haunted eyes stepped off the train in Twin Falls, Idaho, clutching a worn leather portfolio to her chest like it held the only pieces of her soul worth saving. Naomi Foster had traveled 3 weeks from Philadelphia to meet a man whose face she had seen only once in a daguerreotype, a cowboy named Thomas Zeller, who had promised her a home in his advertisement, seeking a wife in the spring of 1882. The platform smelled of coal smoke and sagebrush, and the late April wind carried the scent of the Snake River Canyon, somewhere beyond the scattered buildings that made up this frontier town. She wore her best dress, a faded blue cotton that had been mended so many times the original fabric was hard to distinguish from the patches, and her dark hair was pinned beneath a bonnet that had once belonged to her mother. Thomas stood near the station house, hat in hand, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the wooden planks. He was broader through the shoulders than the photograph suggested, with sun-weathered skin and hands that looked like they knew hard work intimately. His dark hair curled slightly at his collar, and his eyes were the color of creek water in summer, clear and searching. When those eyes found hers, something shifted in his expression, a softening that made her grip on the portfolio loosen just slightly. "Miss Foster." His voice was deeper than she expected, rough around the edges but not unkind. "Mr. Zeller." She managed a nod, her throat tight with nerves and exhaustion. He stepped forward, taking her single battered trunk from where the porter had set it. "Journey was long, I reckon. 3 weeks." She followed him toward a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. "I changed trains 4 times." Thomas loaded her trunk into the wagon bed with an ease that suggested he hauled much heavier loads regularly. When he offered his hand to help her up to the seat, she hesitated only a moment before accepting. His palm was calloused and warm, and he released her the moment she was settled, as though afraid to presume too much too soon. The ride out to his ranch took them east of town, through rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and the occasional stand of juniper trees. The landscape was so different from Philadelphia's crowded streets and brick buildings that Naomi felt like she had traveled to another world entirely. The sky stretched impossibly wide above them, painted in shades of blue she had never seen back east. "Ranch is about 8 miles from town," Thomas said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "I run cattle mostly. Got about 200 head right now, hoping to build that up over the next few years. House is small, but it's sturdy. Built it myself 5 years back when I first claimed the land." Naomi nodded, still clutching the portfolio. She wanted to tell him about what it contained, but the words stuck in her throat. How did you explain to a stranger that you had spent years drawing pictures of a home you had never had, rooms you had never lived in, gardens you had never planted? It sounded foolish even in her own mind. "You got family back in Philadelphia?" Thomas asked, his eyes on the rutted road ahead. "No." The word came out sharper than she intended. "My parents died when I was 12. Cholera. I was raised in an orphanage after that, and when I turned 18, I worked in a textile mill until it closed last winter." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm sorry about your folks. Lost mine too, different circumstances. My father died in the war, and my mother passed from pneumonia when I was 16. Been on my own since then. Came west in 77 looking for land and a fresh start." Something in his tone, the matter-of-fact way he shared his own losses, made Naomi's shoulders relax slightly. They were both orphans of a sort, both survivors. Maybe that was enough of a foundation to build on. The ranch house came into view as they crested a hill, and Naomi's breath caught. It was small, just as Thomas had said, a single-story structure made of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. But it sat in a valley with the river visible in the distance, and the land around it rolled away in gentle waves of spring grass just beginning to green up. Mountains rose purple and distant on the horizon. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Thomas glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face. "It's rough country. Winters are hard, summers can be brutal. Takes a certain kind of person to make a life out here." "I've never had anything beautiful before," Naomi said, and then felt heat rise to her cheeks at the confession. But Thomas just nodded, as though he understood exactly what she meant. He pulled the wagon up in front of the house and helped her down. The door was unlocked, and he pushed it open to reveal a single large room with a fireplace at one end, a cast iron stove in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and a bed against the far wall. Shelves lined one wall, holding supplies and a few books. A ladder led up to what appeared to be a small loft space. "I can sleep in the barn until we're properly married," Thomas said quickly. "The reverend in town can perform the ceremony whenever you're ready, or if you've changed your mind, I can arrange passage back east." "I won't hold you to anything you don't want." Naomi turned to face him, still holding the portfolio. "I haven't changed my mind, but I need to show you something first before we marry, so you know what kind of person you're getting." She set the portfolio on the table and unbuckled the straps with trembling fingers. Inside were dozens of sketches, some on proper paper, others on scraps of newsprint or the backs of mill notices. She spread them out carefully, and Thomas moved closer to look. They were drawings of a house, but not the kind of house that existed in this valley. This house had a wide front porch with railings and posts, windows with flower boxes, a pitched roof with shingles, separate rooms that she had labeled in careful script: kitchen, parlor, bedroom, washroom. There were drawings of the interior too, showing a real table with turned legs, curtains on the windows, a rocking chair near a fireplace, shelves lined with dishes and books. She had drawn the exterior from multiple angles, sketched the garden that would surround it, complete with rose bushes and a white picket fence. Some of the drawings were worn from handling, others were newer, refinements of older ideas. Thomas studied them in silence, his expression unreadable. Naomi's heart hammered against her ribs. "I started drawing these when I was 14, she said quietly. "In the orphanage. The matrons were cruel and the other girls were mean because I was different, too quiet, too strange. I used to lie in my cot at night and imagine a home, a real home where I belonged. During the day, I would steal scraps of paper and draw what I imagined. When I worked at the mill, I spent every spare penny on proper paper and pencils. These drawings are all I have. They're foolish, I know. This house you built is good and solid, and I'm grateful for it. But I wanted you to see these so you would understand that I've spent my whole life dreaming of something I'll never have. I didn't want to deceive you about who I am." Thomas picked up one of the drawings, holding it carefully. It showed the front porch with 2 rocking chairs side by side, and Naomi had drawn shadows suggesting people sitting in them, though their faces were left blank. "These aren't foolish," Thomas said finally, his voice rough. "They're detailed. You've got measurements marked here and notes about materials. This is more than dreaming. This is planning." Naomi blinked back tears. "Planning for something impossible." Thomas set the drawing down and looked at her directly. "What if it wasn't impossible? I don't understand." "I built this house because I needed shelter, needed it fast before the first winter. I used what materials I had and built something functional, but I always figured someday I'd build something better, something permanent. I just never had a reason to do it before now, and I sure didn't have plans as good as these." He gestured to the sketches spread across the table. "If you're willing to marry me, and if you're willing to be patient, I'll build you this house, board by board, exactly like you drew it." Naomi stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You can't mean that." "I've got timber rights up in the mountains. I can cut and mill the wood myself. I've got savings from selling cattle. It'll take time, maybe 2 years, maybe more, but I can do it. I've built barns and corrals in this house. I know what I'm doing." His jaw set in a determined line. "You came all this way because I promised you a home. Let me give you the home you actually want." Something cracked open in Naomi's chest, a place that had been frozen and closed for so long she had forgotten it existed. "Why would you do this?" Thomas's eyes softened. "Because I know what it's like to want something you think you'll never have. I wanted land of my own, a place where I belonged. Took me years to get here, years of working other men's ranches and saving every cent. When I finally got this place, I swore I'd make something of it. But a ranch isn't much without someone to share it with. I placed that advertisement hoping to find a partner, someone who wanted to build a life as much as I did. These drawings tell me you're that person." Naomi touched the edge of the nearest sketch with one finger. "I'll work. I'll help however I can. I'm not afraid of hard work." "I know you're not. Anyone who survived what you survived and still had the strength to dream is stronger than most." Thomas extended his hand. "So is it agreed? We'll get married, work the ranch together, and I'll build your house." Naomi placed her hand in his. "Agreed." They were married 3 days later in the small church in Twin Falls, with the reverend's wife and the mercantile owner serving as witnesses. Naomi wore the same mended blue dress, but Thomas had surprised her with a small bouquet of wildflowers he had picked that morning, purple lupines and yellow balsam root. She carried them during the ceremony, and the sweet smell helped steady her nerves as she repeated the vows that bound her life to this man she barely knew. Thomas had spent those 3 days building a small addition onto the back of the cabin, a separate bedroom with its own door, so Naomi would have privacy. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes about his character. He was giving her space and time, not demanding anything she wasn't ready to give. The first weeks of their marriage were careful and polite. Thomas woke before dawn to tend the cattle and horses, and Naomi learned the rhythms of ranch life. She cooked meals on the cast iron stove, discovering that Thomas had a preference for strong coffee and thick slices of bread with butter. She mended his clothes, scrubbed floors, and tended the small vegetable garden he had started behind the house. In the evenings, Thomas would come in dusty and tired, and they would eat together at the small table, making awkward conversation about the day's work. But slowly, gradually, they began to relax around each other. Thomas started explaining more about the ranch, showing her how to read the brands on the cattle, teaching her the names of his horses. Naomi began asking questions about the land, about his plans for expansion. And in the quiet moments after dinner, Thomas would pull out her sketches and study them, making notes in a small journal he kept. One evening in early May, about 3 weeks after their wedding, Thomas spread a large piece of paper across the table. "I've been thinking about the foundation," he said. "We'll need to dig it deep, make sure it's level and solid. I figure we start with the main structure, get the walls and roof up before winter, then work on the interior and details over the next year." Naomi moved to stand beside him, looking at the rough plans he had sketched. They were based on her drawings but translated into something more practical, with measurements and notes about load-bearing walls and support beams. "You're really going to do this?" she said, wonder in her voice. Thomas looked up at her. "I gave you my word. But it's so much work, and the ranch keeps you busy from dawn to dusk already." "I'll manage, we'll manage." He hesitated, then added, "Unless you've changed your mind about wanting it." "No." Naomi shook her head quickly. I want it more than anything. I just don't want you to exhaust yourself for a dream that's only mine." Thomas reached out and caught her hand, the first time he had initiated contact since their wedding day. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "It stopped being just your dream the day you showed me those drawings. This is ours now." The warmth of his hand, the sincerity in his eyes made something shift in Naomi's heart. She squeezed his fingers gently. "Then we'll build it together." True to his word, Thomas began work on the house the following week. He started by selecting a site about 50 yards from the existing cabin, on a slight rise that would give them a view of the valley and the river beyond. He marked out the foundation with stakes and string, measuring and remeasuring to ensure everything was square and level. Naomi helped him dig, her hands blistering and then callousing as they moved earth and rocks. In between ranch work, Thomas made trips up into the mountains to cut timber. He had an arrangement with a man who owned a small sawmill, and they worked out a deal where Thomas would cut and haul the logs, and the mill owner would saw them into planks in exchange for a portion of the lumber. It was back-breaking work, and Thomas often came home well after dark, so tired he could barely eat before falling into bed. Naomi worried about him, but she also marveled at his determination. She did everything she could to lighten his load, taking on more of the ranch chores. She learned to milk the cow, to feed the chickens, to saddle a horse and ride out to check on the cattle in the near pastures. Thomas taught her patiently, never making her feel foolish for not knowing things that were second nature to him. Summer arrived in full force, bringing with it long hot days and sudden violent thunderstorms that rolled off the mountains. The foundation for the new house took shape, a solid rectangle of stone and mortar that Thomas mixed himself. He was meticulous about every detail, checking and rechecking his work against Naomi's drawings. One afternoon in late June, Naomi rode out to where Thomas was working on the foundation. She had packed a lunch of cold chicken, bread, and pickles, along with a jar of cool water from the spring. Thomas looked up as she approached, his shirt soaked through with sweat, his face streaked with dust. "You're going to work yourself to death," she said, dismounting and tying her horse to a nearby juniper. Thomas wiped his face with his bandana and grinned. "Not today." Foundation's nearly finished. Naomi spread a blanket in the shade and unpacked the food. Thomas joined her, groaning slightly as he lowered himself to the ground. They ate in companionable silence for a while, and then Naomi said, "Tell me about what you want, Thomas." He looked at her quizzically. "What do you mean? I've told you about my dreams, shown you my drawings, but what do you dream about? What do you want from this life we're building?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, chewing thoughtfully. Finally, he said, "I want to build something that lasts. My father died in the war, and my mother worked herself to death trying to keep us fed after that. They never had anything that was truly theirs. I want different than that. I want land that my children will inherit, a home that will stand for generations. I want to look back when I'm old and know that I built something good." "Children!" Naomi's voice came out softer than she intended. Thomas's eyes met hers, and she saw vulnerability there. "Someday, if you want them. I know we haven't talked about that, and I don't want to pressure you. But yes, I'd like children. A family." Naomi felt heat rise to her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "I'd like that too, someday." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of a future that was becoming more real with each passing day. Thomas reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers gentle. "You're stronger than you think, Naomi Foster Zeller. Stronger than I expected when I saw you step off that train looking half scared to death." She laughed, a real laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep. "I was terrified. I thought you'd take one look at me and send me back. Never crossed my mind." His hand lingered near her face and then he leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, he kissed her, soft and careful. Naomi had never been kissed before, and the sensation made her heart race. She kissed him back tentatively, and when they finally pulled apart, Thomas was smiling. "Been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. "Why didn't you? Didn't want to rush you. Wanted you to feel safe here first." Naomi touched his face, feeling the rough stubble under her palm. "I do feel safe. For the first time in my life, I feel safe." They kissed again, longer this time, and when they finally returned to eating lunch, everything felt different between them. The careful politeness was giving way to something warmer, more genuine. By mid-July, the foundation was complete, and Thomas began framing the walls. He had stockpiled enough lumber for the main structure, and he worked with a focused intensity that amazed Naomi. She helped however she could, holding boards steady while he hammered, handing him tools, mixing mortar for the chimney that was taking shape. The work brought them closer in ways Naomi hadn't anticipated. They developed a rhythm, an unspoken understanding of what needed to be done and when. Thomas trusted her to handle tasks that required precision, and she learned quickly, driven by the desire to see her dream take physical form. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch of the old cabin and look at the skeleton of the new house rising against the sunset. Thomas would have his arm around her shoulders, and Naomi would lean into his warmth, feeling contentment she had never imagined possible. "The walls will be up by September," Thomas said one evening. "Then we'll get the roof on before the weather turns. We'll spend this winter in the old cabin still, but next year we'll be in the new house." "It's really happening," Naomi whispered. "I keep thinking I'll wake up and this will all be a dream." Thomas kissed the top of her head. "It's real, you're real, this is real." In August, they got help from some of Thomas's neighbors. Ranch life in Idaho territory was isolated, but the community helped each other when needed. 3 other ranchers and their wives came for a house raising, and in 2 long days of hard work, the main walls went up and the roof beams were set in place. The women brought food and helped Naomi prepare a feast for the workers, and there was laughter and music in the evening as someone produced a fiddle. One of the ranchers, a gruff man named Samuel who owned land to the south, clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "You got yourself a good woman, Zeller." Most wouldn't have the gumption to take on a project like this. Thomas looked across the yard to where Naomi was talking with Samuel's wife, and his expression softened. "She's more than I ever hoped for." By the time the neighbors left, the house had a roof, walls, and window openings. It wasn't finished, not by a long measure, but it looked like a house now, solid and real. Naomi stood inside the empty structure, looking up at the rafters, and felt tears slide down her cheeks. Thomas found her there and pulled her into his arms. "Why are you crying?" "Because I'm happy," she said against his chest. "Because you did this, because it's ours." "It's yours," he corrected gently. "This was your vision, I'm just the carpenter." Naomi pulled back to look at him. "No, it's ours. I never want you to think otherwise. Every board, every nail, this is something we're building together." That night, for the first time since their wedding, Naomi went to Thomas's room instead of her own. She was nervous, her hands trembling as she pushed open his door, but he welcomed her with tenderness that eased her fears. They came together carefully, learning each other in the darkness, and afterward, Naomi lay in his arms feeling truly whole for the first time in her life. Fall arrived with crisp mornings and aspen trees turning gold in the mountains. Thomas worked on the interior of the house whenever he could spare time from the ranch. He installed the windows, real glass panes ordered from a supplier in Boise, and hung the doors. He built a staircase to the second floor where there would be bedrooms, crafting each step with care. Naomi sewed curtains from fabric she bought in town, choosing patterns that matched the colors in her original drawings. She painted the interior walls with whitewash, standing on ladders and stretching to reach the high corners. Her body ached from the work, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from creating something rather than just surviving. In October, they received word that Thomas's cattle sale had gone well, bringing in more money than he had anticipated. He used part of it to order finished lumber for the interior trim and flooring, and to buy a cast iron cook stove for the new kitchen, one much nicer than the simple stove in the old cabin. "We should save that money," Naomi protested when she saw the stove being delivered. "We don't need fancy things." Thomas shook his head. "You've cooked on that old stove without complaining for 6 months. This one is better, safer. You deserve it." Naomi had learned by now that arguing with Thomas when he was set on something was pointless. Besides, the new stove was beautiful, with decorative scrollwork and multiple cooking surfaces. She ran her hand over the smooth iron, imagining all the meals she would prepare on it. Winter came early that year, with snow falling in mid-November. Work on the house slowed but didn't stop. Thomas installed the flooring, laying each plank with precision. He built cabinets in the kitchen, copying the design from Naomi's drawings but adding small touches of his own, like carved pulls on the drawers. They spent Christmas in the old cabin, but Naomi decorated the new house with evergreen branches and red ribbons. Thomas surprised her with a gift on Christmas morning, a beautiful rocking chair made of cherry wood, its arms smooth and curved. "For the new parlor," he said. "I started making it back in June, worked on it in the evenings after you went to bed." Naomi cried and kissed him and insisted they move the chair into the new house immediately, even though the house wasn't ready to live in yet. They placed it in the parlor where she had drawn it in her sketches, and Naomi sat in it, rocking slowly, looking around at the room that was becoming real. "Thank you," she whispered, "for all of this, for believing in my foolish dreams." Thomas knelt beside the chair and took her hand. "They weren't foolish, and I need to tell you something." Naomi's heart skipped. "What is it?" "I love you, Naomi. I think I started falling in love with you the day you showed me those drawings and trusted me with something so precious. I know this started as an arrangement, a practical solution for both of us, but it became something more. You became everything to me." Naomi cupped his face in her hands. "I love you too. I was afraid to admit it, afraid it was too soon or too presumptuous. But I do. I love you, Thomas Zeller." They held each other in the unfinished parlor as snow fell outside, and Naomi thought about how far she had come from that frightened girl stepping off the train. She had found more than a home. She had found herself. January and February were hard months, with temperatures plunging below zero and snowdrifts piling high around both houses. Thomas still had to tend the cattle, breaking ice on water troughs and making sure the herd had access to hay. Naomi kept the home fires burning and worried every time he went out in the bitter cold. But the forced indoor time also meant Thomas could focus on finished work inside the new house. He installed trim around the windows and doors, built shelves and closets, crafted a mantelpiece for the parlor fireplace that was decorated with simple but elegant carvings. Naomi painted and varnished, her hands perpetually stained with wood stain and her hair smelling of linseed oil. In late February, Naomi realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another week, not wanting to say anything until she was certain, and then she told Thomas one evening as they worked together in the new kitchen. "I think I'm with child," she said quietly, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Thomas went very still, and then a slow smile spread across his face. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be. It's early yet, but all the signs are there." Thomas crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "We're going to have a baby. Naomi, we're going to have a baby." His joy was infectious, and Naomi laughed, her earlier nervousness melting away. "I'm glad you're happy. I was worried it might be too soon." "Too soon. This is perfect. Everything is perfect." He set her down carefully as if she were suddenly made of glass. "You have to take it easy now. No more climbing ladders or lifting heavy things." "Thomas, I'm pregnant, not dying. I can still work." "Not like you have been. Promise me you'll be careful." Naomi saw the genuine concern in his eyes and relented. "I promise. But I'm still going to help finish the house. This baby will be born in the home I dreamed of, not the old cabin." They pushed hard through March and April, racing against Naomi's expanding belly. Thomas hired 2 men from town to help with the final exterior work, installing the porch railings and posts that matched Naomi's drawings exactly. Naomi sewed like a woman possessed, making curtains for every window, cushions for the rocking chair, and the new sofa Thomas had ordered as a surprise. In early May, almost exactly 1 year after they had married, they moved into the new house. It wasn't completely finished. There were still rooms upstairs that needed work, and the garden was just planted seeds and hope, but it was livable and beautiful. Naomi stood in the parlor, looking at the curtains she had sewn hanging in the windows, at the furniture carefully arranged, at the mantel where Thomas had placed a framed copy of her original sketch of the house. "What do you think?" Thomas asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her gently, mindful of her swelling belly. "I think it's more beautiful than I ever imagined. I think you worked magic, turning my drawings into this." "We worked magic," Thomas corrected, "both of us together." They spent that first night in their new bedroom, in the bed Thomas had built from solid oak, under quilts that Naomi had pieced together over the winter. The house creaked and settled around them, learning its own rhythms, and Naomi felt a peace so profound it brought tears to her eyes. The baby came in late July, born during a fierce thunderstorm that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. The doctor from town arrived in time, and Thomas held Naomi's hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement and love. When the baby finally emerged, squalling and red-faced, the doctor announced, "It's a boy, a healthy, strong boy." Thomas cut the cord with shaking hands, and the doctor placed the baby in Naomi's arms. She looked down at her son, their son, and felt love so fierce it was almost painful. "He needs a name," Thomas said softly, tears streaming down his face. "Daniel," Naomi said. "Daniel Thomas Zeller. Perfect." Thomas kissed her forehead, then gently touched the baby's tiny hand. "Hello, Daniel. Welcome home." The next months passed in a blur of sleepless nights and the overwhelming demands of a newborn. But the house held them securely, each room serving its purpose exactly as Naomi had envisioned. The kitchen with its big stove made preparing meals easier. The parlor with its fireplace kept them warm when autumn arrived again. The bedroom upstairs that Thomas finished during Naomi's pregnancy became the nursery where Daniel slept in a cradle Thomas had carved with meticulous care. Naomi sometimes stood at the kitchen window, washing dishes or kneading bread, and looked out at the valley that had become home. She thought about the orphanage in Philadelphia, about the cruel matrons and the cold dormitory where she had lain awake dreaming impossible dreams. She thought about the girl she had been, so certain she would never have anything good or beautiful in her life. That girl would never have believed this was possible. Thomas proved to be a devoted father, as careful and patient with Daniel as he had been with every board of the house. He would walk the floor with the baby at night, singing old songs in his rough voice, and Naomi would watch them from the doorway, her heart full to bursting. The ranch prospered. Thomas's cattle herd grew, and he bought more land, expanding their holdings. He hired a couple of ranch hands to help with the work, which gave him more time to spend with his family. Naomi tended her garden, which flourished in the rich soil. The rose bushes she had planted bloomed spectacularly, their scent filling the summer air. When Daniel was a year old, Naomi discovered she was pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she wasn't simultaneously helping build a house. Their daughter was born in April of 1885, during a gentle spring rain that left the air smelling green and new. "Margaret," Naomi said, holding the tiny girl. "Margaret Rose Zeller, after your mother." Thomas asked, remembering the stories Naomi had told him about the woman who died when she was 12. "Yes, I want her to have something from the family I lost." Thomas kissed them both, his wife and his daughter, and then went to get Daniel, who was staying with Samuel and his wife during the birth. The boy toddled into the bedroom and climbed onto the bed with his mother's help, peering curiously at his new sister. "Baby," Daniel pronounced, poking Margaret's cheek gently. "Your sister," Naomi told him. "You're going to be the best big brother." Life settled into a rhythm, the good kind of rhythm that comes from happiness rather than mere routine. Thomas continued to improve the ranch and the house, always finding some new project. He built a white picket fence around the front garden, exactly like the one in Naomi's drawings. He constructed a barn that was the envy of the county, with solid walls and a sound roof. He added a room onto the house for an office where he kept his records, and Naomi could do her sewing. Naomi found she had a talent for drawing more than just houses. She sketched their children, capturing Daniel's mischievous grin and Margaret's solemn eyes. She drew the ranch, the valley, the mountains in the distance. Thomas had several of her sketches framed, and they hung throughout the house, a gallery of their life together. The years passed, each one building on the last. Daniel grew into a sturdy boy who followed his father everywhere, learning the ranch work with eager attention. Margaret was quieter, more thoughtful, but she loved the animals and had a special way with horses that reminded Thomas of himself at that age. In 1888, Naomi gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Samuel and Joseph. The house that had once seemed so spacious suddenly felt full, echoing with the sounds of children's laughter and occasional squabbles. Thomas added another bedroom upstairs, and Naomi joked that they were going to need an even bigger house if they kept expanding their family. "I'll build you whatever you need," Thomas said, completely serious. "Another house, another barn, whatever you want." But Naomi shook her head. "This house is perfect. It holds all of us and all our love. I don't need anything more." Still, Thomas couldn't help but continue improving their home. He added a covered walkway to the barn so Naomi wouldn't get soaked when she went to milk the cow in the rain. He built a playhouse for the children, a miniature version of their house that delighted them endlessly. He planted more trees around the property, thinking of shade for future grandchildren. In the evenings, after the children were in bed, Thomas and Naomi would sit in the parlor, often in the 2 rocking chairs that now flanked the fireplace. Thomas would read the newspaper from town, and Naomi would sew or draw, and they would talk about their day, their dreams, their plans. "Do you remember that first day?" Thomas asked one night in the fall of 1890. They had been married 8 years, and Naomi was expecting their 6th child. "When you stepped off the train looking like you were ready to bolt at any second," Naomi laughed, her hand resting on her rounded belly. "I was terrified. I thought you'd be disappointed, that I wouldn't be what you wanted. I took one look at you and knew my life was about to change. I just didn't know how much." Thomas reached over and took her hand. "You've given me everything, Naomi. The home, the children, the life I always wanted but didn't know how to ask for. You gave me those things too," Naomi said softly. "You took my dreams seriously when no one else ever had. You built me a home when I thought I'd never have one. You loved me when I didn't even know I deserved to be loved. You deserved everything good in this world. I just wish I could have given it to you sooner, saved you from all those hard years." Naomi squeezed his hand. "Those hard years made me appreciate this life all the more. I don't regret them. They led me to you, to this house, to our family. I wouldn't change a thing." Their sixth child, another daughter they named Catherine, was born in December. She arrived during a snowstorm, and Thomas barely made it back with the doctor in time. Catherine was tiny but fierce, with dark hair like her father and eyes that would eventually turn the same blue as her mother's. The turn of the century approached, and with it came changes to the territory. Idaho had become a state in 1890, and Twin Falls was growing, transforming from a rough frontier town into a proper community with schools and churches and businesses. Thomas served on the school board, and Naomi joined the church ladies' auxiliary, though she still felt slightly out of place among women who had grown up with advantages she never had. But her children never knew hunger or cold or fear. They grew up secure in the knowledge that they were loved, that they had a home that was truly theirs. Daniel, the oldest, showed an aptitude for ranching and announced at 15 that he wanted to work the land like his father. Margaret loved school and talked about becoming a teacher. The twins were inseparable, getting into and out of trouble with equal enthusiasm. Catherine was still small but showed signs of having inherited her mother's artistic talent. In 1902, when Naomi was 40 years old and Thomas was 43, they celebrated their 20th anniversary. The children threw them a party, with help from the neighboring ranchers who had become dear friends over the years. Someone had made a cake, and there were gifts and laughter and music as the same fiddle that had played at their house raising 20 years ago sang out again. Thomas presented Naomi with a gift, a leather-bound book with blank pages. "For more sketches," he said. "Though I have to say, you've already drawn the most important thing, our life together." Naomi opened the book and found that the first page wasn't blank. Thomas had carefully glued in the original sketch she had shown him that first week, the drawing of the house with the 2 rocking chairs on the porch. Beneath it, he had written in his careful hand, "She dreamed it. We built it. We lived it. With all my love, Thomas." Naomi couldn't speak through her tears, so she just held him, and their children gathered around them, this family they had created together. Later that night, after the guests had gone home and the children were in bed, Thomas and Naomi walked out to look at the house. A full moon illuminated it, casting long shadows across the porch where 2 rocking chairs sat side by side, just as Naomi had drawn them 20 years ago. "It looks just like your sketch," Thomas said. "Exactly like it. Better," Naomi corrected, "because it's full of life and love and memories." "My sketch was just lines on paper. You made it real." "We made it real," Thomas insisted, just as he always did. They stood there for a long time, looking at the home they had built board by board, looking at the life they had created together. The house stood solid and sure, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness, smoke curling from the chimney into the cold night air. Daniel married in 1904, bringing home a sweet girl named Sarah who fit into the family as though she had always belonged. They moved into the old cabin, which Thomas had kept maintained, and started their own life on a portion of the ranch. Within a year, they made Thomas and Naomi grandparents with the birth of a daughter they named Naomi after her grandmother. Holding her namesake, The original Naomi felt the wheel of life turning, continuing. This baby girl would grow up knowing security and love, would never have to dream of a home she thought she'd never have because she would always belong. Margaret did become a teacher, taking a position at the school in Twin Falls. She married one of the town's merchants in 1906, a kind man who supported her desire to keep teaching even after they wed. The twins, Samuel and Joseph, both chose to work the ranch with their father and Daniel, expanding the operation until the Zeller Ranch was one of the most successful in the region. Catherine showed remarkable artistic talent, and when she was 17, Naomi and Thomas sent her to an art school in Denver for a year. She came back even more gifted, and she set up a studio in one of the upstairs rooms, painting and drawing. Her work started selling in galleries as far away as Salt Lake City. Thomas retired from active ranching in 1912, leaving the daily operations to his sons while he focused on being a grandfather to the growing horde of grandchildren. He was 63 years old, his hair completely gray now, his hands gnarled from decades of hard work. But he was still strong, still capable, and he spent his days helping with whatever was needed and spoiling his grandchildren shamelessly. Naomi, at 60, had silver threading through her dark hair, and her hands bore the marks of a lifetime of work. But she was healthy and happy, surrounded by the family she had never dared to dream she could have. She kept house, tended her garden, and drew constantly, filling book after book with sketches of her children and grandchildren, of the ranch, of the life that had exceeded every hope. On their 30th anniversary in 1912, the family gathered again for a celebration. There were so many of them now that they spilled out of the house onto the porch and into the yard. Children of 3 generations ran around playing games while the adults talked and laughed. Thomas stood on the porch and called for everyone's attention. When the crowd quieted, he put his arm around Naomi and said, "30 years ago, I placed an advertisement for a wife, not really knowing what I was asking for or hoping for. And a woman I had never met traveled across the country to take a chance on a life with a stranger. That woman showed me sketches of a home she had drawn, a home she thought she'd never have. I promised to build it for her, and I kept that promise. But what I didn't know then was that she was going to build something even more important. She built this family, this life, this love that we're all standing in the middle of right now." He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. "Naomi, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You took my rough hands and rough ways and loved me anyway. You gave me children who are better than I ever deserved. You made this house a home, and you made my life worth living. I love you more today than I did 30 years ago, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today. Thank you for getting on that train. Thank you for taking a chance. Thank you for every single day you've given me." Naomi was crying, and so was half the crowd. She stood on her toes and kissed Thomas, not caring that their children and grandchildren were watching. When she pulled back, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "You built me a house, Thomas Zeller, but you also built me a life, and that's a far more precious thing. I love you beyond measure." The celebration continued long into the evening, but eventually, as always, it was just Thomas and Naomi again, sitting in their rocking chairs on the porch as the stars came out overhead. The night was warm, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear cattle lowing softly. "Do you ever miss Philadelphia?" Thomas asked, a question he had never asked in 30 years. Naomi didn't even have to think about it. "No, never, not for a single moment. This is home. This has always been home even before I got here. I just had to find my way to it. And to me," Thomas added. "And to you," Naomi agreed, reaching over to take his hand. They rocked in comfortable silence. These two people who had started as strangers bound by a practical arrangement and had become something so much more. Around them, the house they had built together stood strong, its walls holding decades of memories, its rooms echoing with the ghosts of laughter and tears, and all the moments that make up a life. The house had started as sketches, as dreams drawn by a lonely orphan girl who had never known a real home. Thomas had taken those dreams seriously, had worked board by board to make them real. But in the process, they had both discovered that a home wasn't really about walls and roofs and well-fitted doors. It was about the people inside it, the love that filled it, the life that was lived there. Naomi had brought sketches of a home she never had. Thomas had built it board by board. Together, they had filled it with something neither of them had possessed before: belonging, security, love, family. They had built not just a house but a legacy that would outlast them both. As the years continued to pass, that legacy only grew stronger. More grandchildren were born, and eventually, great-grandchildren. The ranch expanded and prospered. The house stood firm through harsh winters and hot summers, through storms and droughts and all the challenges that life in Idaho could bring. Thomas lived to be 74, passing away peacefully in his sleep in the bedroom he had shared with Naomi for more than 40 years. His sons and grandsons carried him to the plot on the hill behind the house, where they buried him with a simple stone that read, "Thomas Zeller, builder of dreams." Naomi lived another 7 years after Thomas, surrounded always by her children and grandchildren. She never stopped drawing, and her final sketch, done just weeks before her own death, was of the house again, but this time she drew it from a distance, showing the whole ranch, the barn, the fences, the gardens, all of it together. She labeled it simply, "Home." When she died at 81, her family buried her next to Thomas under the big cottonwood tree he had planted the year they were married. Her stone read, "Naomi Foster Zeller, dreamer and beloved." The house continued to stand, lived in first by Daniel and his family, then passed down through the generations. Each family that lived there added their own touches, but they also maintained the original structure, the bones that Thomas had built so carefully. They kept Naomi's drawings, framed now and hanging in the parlor like precious heirlooms. And every generation heard the story of how their ancestor had arrived as a mail-order bride, carrying nothing but a worn leather portfolio full of sketches of a home she had never had. They heard about how Thomas had looked at those sketches and promised to build that house, and how he had kept his promise, working board by board to turn dreams into reality. The story became part of the family's identity, a reminder that dreams were worth pursuing, that love could be built on foundations of respect and shared purpose. That home wasn't something you were born into, but something you created with your own hands and heart. Over a century later, the house still stood on its rise overlooking the Snake River Valley. It had been carefully restored and maintained, and it looked much as it had when Thomas finished it in 1883. The porch still had railings and posts, windows still had flower boxes, rose bushes still bloomed in the garden, and 2 rocking chairs still sat side by side on the porch. Visitors to the ranch, usually descendants coming to see where their family had begun, would stand and look at the house and marvel that it had started as sketches, as the desperate dreams of a lonely girl in an orphanage. They would think about Naomi, stepping off that train in 1882, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. They would think about Thomas, seeing those sketches and understanding immediately how precious they were. And they would understand what Naomi and Thomas had known from the very beginning, that home wasn't about the building, though the building mattered. Home was about the love that filled it, the family that grew in it, the memories made there, and the legacy passed down through generations. Naomi had brought sketches of a home she never had. Thomas had built it board by board. Together, they had created something that lasted far longer than either of them, something that became a testament to the power of dreams and love, and the simple act of taking someone else's vision seriously. The house stood as proof that sometimes the most impossible dreams are the ones worth fighting for. That a mail-order bride and a cowboy could build not just a house, but a dynasty. That love, real love, could start with practical arrangements and grow into something that changed the course of generations. And on quiet evenings, when the wind moved through the valley just right, some said you could almost see two figures sitting in the rocking chairs on the porch, holding hands as they watched the sunset paint the sky in colors of gold and rose. Whether this was true or just a romantic fancy, no one could say for certain. But what was certain, what would always be certain, was that Naomi Foster and Thomas Zeller had taken a chance on each other in 1882. She had shown him her dreams, and he had made them real. In the process, they had built a love story that would endure long after the last board of that carefully constructed house finally weathered away. Their great-great-great-grandchildren still lived on the ranch, still worked the land, still maintained the house that had started as sketches in a leather portfolio. They knew the story by heart, could recite it like a prayer or a promise. And they understood that they were living in a dream that had come true, a dream that had been dreamed by a frightened girl in an orphanage who had dared to imagine a home, a family, a life worth living. Naomi had brought the vision. Thomas had built it into reality. Together, they had created something eternal, a love and a legacy that proved that sometimes, just sometimes, dreams really do come true. You just have to find someone who believes in your dreams as much as you do, someone willing to work board by board, day by day, to build something beautiful together. The house stood as their monument, but the real legacy was in the hearts of every person who descended from them, every child who grew up secure and loved, every family that understood the value of home and hard work, and taking other people's dreams seriously. From Philadelphia to Idaho, from sketches to reality, from strangers to soulmates, from a rough cabin to a beautiful house, from 2 people to 6 generations, and counting, this was the story of Naomi and Thomas, of dreams and boards and love that built a legacy. This was the story of how a mail-order bride brought sketches of a home she never had, and how a cowboy built it board by board, and how together they filled it with a life more beautiful than either of them had ever dared to imagine. And on the hill behind the house, under the cottonwood tree that had grown massive and ancient, 2 stones stood side by side, just like the rocking chairs on the porch, a perfect symbol of 2 lives lived in partnership, 2 hearts bound together, 2 dreamers who made their dreams reality and left behind something that would last forever.